Hello everybody, I'm getting ready to glass bed this HW90 action to the stock, and I got some observations and a couple of updates. So first off, yesterday when I was filming, I already published that video, I mentioned that the forearm mounting flanges on the action are a little bent out, and I conjectured that it was from them not being bedded to the stock and the forearm screws pulling them in. I actually don't believe that's the case. They're far too strong for that. You can't get that much force on little common slotted screws. I think it's more likely either poor manufacturing tolerances. I think that's probably most likely based on some other things I'm seeing, or maybe the force the cocking arm puts on those flanges, but I really don't think that's the case. I think it probably was during manufacturing. So nix that previous comment about screws, although certainly it needs to be bedded for sure. The other thing is I had mentioned that when I put the inertial damper in, it was a little rough going in, so I wasn't happy with that. I took it back out. I did a burnished moly routine on the inside of the piston for the inertial dampener. But then as I realized that that inertial damper is really nothing more than just a top hat, just a heavy insert to go in the piston to keep the piston from bouncing back when it flies forward and compresses the air and squirts it out the barrel. It's a cushion, and it causes the piston to bounce back, and so we put a heavy top hat on there to make sure it just keeps pushing. And I think that's all it is. It doesn't need to slide. It didn't need to be smooth or not sticky in its motion. So, not liking the fact that I had left a little bit of carrier grease behind in there, I washed it all out and removed that moly and put the inertial damper in with just the super lube. Okay, so those are two updated thoughts on what I previously published, but now we're looking, let me tell you that I took it out to the gun range Saturday and shot it. Oh, no, there's more and more. I looked at the end of the muzzle and with the jeweler's loop, and it was really rough inside. The actual rifling was down inside the muzzle a little ways, and it was pretty rough. So the client had sent this to me to cut the choke off and recrown it, but I don't really want to cut the choke off until I verify that all the other things have been taken care of, and it really needs to be done. But clearly the crown was an issue, so I cut an 11-degree target crown on there and exposed the rifling right at the end, and I doubt this camera will be able to pick that up. No, you can't focus that close, but trust me, it's a beautiful thing. Alright, so, shooting it. Some shots touching, some shots wild flyers. Ooh, say that 3 times fast. And I'm pretty sure I know why, because the action moves around in the stock a lot. You can feel it even just cocking. We can see, I don't want to let this stuff fall apart here, that huge, let's see if I can get this right. Can you see that huge gap between the end of the action and the wood? It's got to be at least 1/8 of an inch. It's pretty crazy. So we're going to take care of that. We're going to glass bed that so under recoil the wood and the metal become as one. But I think I've identified what the real issue is. So here I am. You'll see in a minute, the trigger guard is a complex part of the mechanism, and it bolts directly to the action itself, and the wood is in between. So here I am just holding the trigger against the action on their mating surfaces. And can you see that? How much the wood is moving? That's because, let me take the trigger guard off. You can see here how the action fits through the stock, and I'm not sure you can tell, but the steel is proud of the wood. That is, it's sticking up past the wood. And the trigger guard mounts directly to the steel. That means there's, well, I'd say a good a good 16th inch, or maybe a little less than that, airspace between the trigger guard and the wood. So no matter how tightly you tighten this down, all you're doing is tightening it onto the metal, and you never come in contact with the wood, and it just moves around a ton. So I see that this is a little bit special case. We're going to be also glass bedding the trigger guard to the wood. And I'm going to have to think about if I want to give it like a piece of plastic tape spacer, so that when we tighten the trigger guard down, we're actually compressing into the stock a little bit to squeeze the stock down. I'll give it some thought. I may just go for the absolute perfect fit, but I kind of like the idea of putting a little pressure on the wood. Anyway, I'll let you know what I come up with for that. So we're going to be glass bedding the trigger guard to the stock. We're going to put some bedding compound back here to fill up that giant gap. And here, let me just pop the action out. And we will bed the action, the compression tube into the wood on both sides here, and maybe a couple spots here. Might even just do a whole line. I'm not quite sure about that. You know, another interesting thing is this stock must have been multi-purposed. I don't know what other gun this was for, or I should say what other action, but it's got this big relief hole cut in here that looks like that would have been for where we usually have an actions mounting bolt going through the stock, but this action doesn't have that. So that's just a superfluous hole. I'm not going to bother filling it. It's just kind of interesting to see that this stock design must have seen use in another action as well. So let's see. Yep. Oh, and then of course we're going to glass bed where the forearm screw flanges are right here. And I see a little bit of an impression of the metal there. Maybe it's a closer fit than I imagined. So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to get prepped up. I'm going to use a carbide bit, this little carbide bit in the Dremel, to rough up the wood everywhere that I'm going to put bedding compound. I'm going to PVA wax, I'm going to Partall number 2 wax the steel, and then after that dries, then I will be applying polyvinyl alcohol, PVA, mold release on top of that, and then we'll be mixing up epoxy laminating resin with a mix of walnut dust, milled glass fiber, and a little bit of Cabosil to give it the consistency I want. We're going to be looking for about a peanut butter, or a little thicker than peanut butter, cold peanut butter maybe, consistency to the mix. And so once I'm prepped, I got to clean up the workspace a little bit and get ready for glue, and I'll turn the camera back on as I go through those steps. But I think this is going to significantly improve the performance of this gun, and at least after we get this done, we'll go back out to the gun range and we'll shoot it, and then we'll really be able to tell whether that muzzle needs to be cut or not. Let's cut the crown off, cut the choke off. Okay everybody, I'll be back in a few minutes. Hello everybody, well it turns out today is now tomorrow. Got a phone call from a web hosting customer, had an issue, and then that sent me down a 4-hour path and never get back out to the shop yesterday. But here I am now, and just want to update you on where I'm at and what I'm about to do on glass bedding this HW90 to its factory stock, which was a super loose fit. I mean, crazy loose. And we'll go over that as we go along. So you already know that I waxed the metal with Partall number 2 wax. What's unique about it is it's a non-silicate wax. The kind of wax you put on your car has silicates. It makes water and liquids bead. In this case, we want liquid to sheet because on top of the wax goes polyvinyl alcohol, which is a liquid, and it won't work if it beads. It creates a microscopic onion skin is what it does. So Partall number 2 goes on first, allow that to dry. You can buff it or not, doesn't matter for this kind of work. And in composites work, you know, we buff it so that it's nice and shiny, which has its own challenges, by the way. And then I put a coat of PVA mold release on top of that, which is not necessary by any means, but because I have it, why not use it? And it guarantees there's not going to be any sticking issues. But I've never had a action stick using even just the wax. I don't know if I've only used just the wax, so I always use the PVA. Anyway, I'm sure it's not a problem. So then the end of this action has some details, the epoxy could get into. This is like a plug that comes out of the end, and it's got a couple of holes in it that are down in the glue area. So I filled them with plasticine modeling clay. So I heat it up with the heat gun, mold it in your hand a little bit, heat it up some more, make it nice and soft and pliable, rub it in really good into all those crevices, and then very lightly, so as not to scratch the metal, use a razor blade and just slice it all right off. It's very easily done. It looks messy because of the wax and the PVA and then the plasticine modeling clay, but I assure you when I'm done, this will wash up in oil and it'll just be pristine, gorgeous. I also wrapped a piece of tape around this bent metal trigger containing thing. It's a pretty big thing. Just to keep any glue out of there. Not that it would really matter. There's not going to be a lot, but I felt like I'd just hedge my bet. And then to prep the stock, I used a small carbide bit and a Dremel, or a Fordham, if that's what you prefer. And I've had Fordhams. The Dremel is pretty convenient. The issue I have with Dremel is the cooling holes are right where you hold it when you're working. So at some point I end up burning them up. For $100 you get a number of years of use out of them at my level of use, and I find it a little handier. I've had Fordhams. The bummer with the Fordham is you can't run it in reverse, which would be really cool. Anyway, I digress. So I used the carbide burr to rough up all the areas of wood that are going to get glue. So that's going to be back here where I showed you there's a giant gap, and down at the bottom of that space, 2 spots on both sides of the forearm for the compression tube, and where the forearm mounting flanges go on the inside there. Then I don't usually bother taping off the forearm, the top of the forearm, but I did here because this is a white wood, probably beech stock, and it can't really be sanded and restained. If it was walnut, I could just stick this on the belt sander after it's done, take the epoxy off, a couple wipes of oil, and it'd be perfect. But here I put tape on there, and after I'm done screeding the epoxy off, I'm going to go ahead and remove that. Just to make sure that no epoxy seeped underneath the edge, and if it did, I'll clean that up before it cures so that I don't have to deal with trying to sand and stain or something the wood. So that's that. Now, one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to do the action first and the trigger guard second as a second step. After this cures and I pop the action out, do all the cleanup, stick it back down in there, then I'll bed the trigger guard. And I'm doing it that way because I realize what's important here to not have any movement between the wood and the metal is the trigger guard and action need to be squishing the wood through this area. So I want to make sure I get it, maybe a dozen or so thou, 20 thou maybe of extra height here so that I get some squishing action when the trigger is bolted to the action. Yep. I'm going to use lawn, random length as it turns out, Allen's for the forearm screws. Lets me just screw it in with my fingers, don't have to use a tool, don't have to get the, if I use the factory screws, they'd have to get cinched down right to their heads, and then I'd probably have to clean that up from the glue that gets on there. So these are waxed, they're going to go in there. They don't need to crank down, right? They just need to define the location of these holes. I even thought about enlarging these holes. I may yet, now that I'm talking about it. because that gives me an opportunity to create a hard point in there. If I over drill these holes, fill it with bedding compounds, stick these screws in there, let it cure, then what we've effectively done is created a glass bedded pillar bed, basically, is what it amounts to, effect there in those holes. And I might do that, actually. I might put the camera on pause and open up those holes. They are already kind of loose. Yeah, they're pretty big fit. But I think I might just guarantee that we get a nice hard point and then open those up. So yeah, I think I'm going to do that, and I'll come back and then we'll talk about how we're going to mix the epoxy, and then I'll shut up and actually do it, which won't take very long. Alright, so I'm going to go open up these forearm holes and I'll be right back.